争、平和、責任と題してプログラムを組ませていただきました。上智大学と戦争、地域にまつわる講演と2本の発表を用意しております。第二次世界大戦が終結してから80年の月日が流れましたが、世界各地ではいまだにですね、残酷な戦火が絶えません。かつて隣接するアジアの人々への多大な損害を与えた日本でも、差別と排外主義がマジョリティを形成するに至っています。本年4月に亡くなったフランシスコ前教皇様はですね、最後まで世界平和の実現に心を尽くされていましたが、その意思を受け継ぐべき上智大学の学生、教職員には今一体何ができるでしょうか。ソフィア・アーカイブスでは7月から9月にかけてですね、本学の歩んだ戦前、戦中、戦後の事績を想起し、未来へつなぐための企画展示を行いました。今回のイベントでは、学生有志の積極的な協力を得まして、展示の成果を生かしながら、戦争に関わる記憶をより広く、地域のものとしても共有して、共に考えつつ、より良い未来を実現するための足がかりを作っていきたいと思っております。本イベントに参加される皆さんも、今後も含めまして、主体的にご協力を賜れたら幸いです。まずは戦時期のですね、日本、特に上智大学の教職員と学生たちが生きてきた時代の理解を深めていただくために、名誉教授中井圭人先生に講演をお願いしたいと思っております。圭人中井先生は本学の名誉教授でいらっしゃいます。アメリカのスタンフォード大学で学士号と修士号を取得し、1972年にハーバード大学で博士号を取得されました。その後、ハーバード大学、オレゴン大学を経て、1980年に当時の外国学部比較文化学科、現在の国際教養学部にですね、着任されております。以降、2010年に退職されるまで30年にわたって教鞭を取られたほか、1997年から2010年までは、本学の誇る日本研究の学術雑誌、モニュメンタ・ニポニカの編集長も務められました。ご専門は日本の近世、近代の思想史、新井白石や水戸学、神道史ですが、上智大学の歴史に関する論文も多数執筆されています。本日は戦時期の上智大学1931年から45年までというタイトルで講演をしてくださいます。それでは中井先生、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. On the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, it's an honor to be asked to talk with you today about what the war meant for Sophia University. You'll notice from the talk's title that I've adopted a broad definition of the war period. One that sees it as having several stages. What I've summed up as an era of war started in September 1931 with the engineering of the Manchurian incident by Japanese military forces. The military activities that followed led 6 years later, in July 1937, to a full-scale invasion of China. The war with China expanded in December 1941 into an all-out war with the United States and its allies that was fought across the vast expanse of the Asia-Pacific region. The era of war finally ended in August 1945 with Japan's defeat. Since time is limited, I'll focus on 4 dimensions of Sophia's experience during this extended war era. First, to prepare the ground for considering what happened at Sophia during the war years, I'll sketch its position within the world of Japanese higher education in the preceding period. I'll also touch on the military training program that became part of the higher educational scene from the mid-1920s and that figured prominently in Sophia's experience of the war years. Second, I'll look at a crisis that Sophia faced early in the war era, in which the military training program played a central role. This was the Yasukuni incident of 1932-1933. That incident left a deep imprint on the university's subsequent direction. And in the third section of this talk, I'll take a look at some aspects of that imprint in the years leading up to and following the outbreak of the war with China in 1937. In the fourth and final section of the talk, I'll take up some of the consequences of the expansion into a yet wider and more total war from late 1941. The demand to devote ever more resources, human and otherwise, to the war effort brought new challenges to educational institutions, particularly those that, like Sophia, focused on so-called bunke, or non-scientific and engineering subject areas. Let us now turn to the first topic, Sophia's position within the overall system of Japanese higher education in the 1930s and the military training program. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Sophia made several notable steps in raising its status as an institution of higher education. The Ministry of Education originally recognized Sophia at the time of its founding in 1913 as a specialized school, Senmongakko. At the time, this was the accreditation category for all institutions of higher learning, state and private, apart from the imperial universities and the pre-war higher schools that prepared students to enter the imperial universities. But in 1918, the government promulgated the University Ordinance and allowed some private schools to gain recognition as full-fledged universities on a par with the imperial universities. The University Ordinance was essentially a filtering mechanism. It set various standards that had to be met to be accredited under it. Most crucially, it required raising an endowment that was to be kept deposited in a government bank and that was supposed to help ensure the school's financial stability. By setting these standards, the government pushed the specialized schools to upgrade themselves, and it rewarded those that were able to meet the standards with a higher status of fully recognized university. From the school's perspective, that recognition and higher status could be expected to bring a competitive advantage in attracting more and better students. Although the hurdles for gaining recognition were high, one by one, the best established private specialized schools, beginning with Waseda and Keio, thus met the requirements and secured elevation to the new category of university accredited under the University Ordinance. By 1927, there were 22 such private universities. Sophia was of much more recent origin than these 22 schools, but its leaders were determined to join their ranks. And in 1928, they finally managed to raise the necessary endowment and meet the other criteria and win admission to the elite category of University Ordinance University. Among other things, Sophia embarked on a major building project and reshaping of the campus to improve its physical facilities. The highlight of this project was the construction of Building 1, which was completed in June 1932. Sophia took other steps as well to raise its profile. It had converted its original specialized school program, basically as it was, into the new University Ordinance University program. This was a 5-year program with a 2-year preparatory division and a 3-year main division, and 2 subject areas, letters, specifically philosophy and literature, and commerce. In 1931, however, Sophia followed the example of other university ordinance universities and established as well an auxiliary specialized division, Semmonbu. This was a 3-year program, a night school program, that provided a certificate of completion, but not a university degree. The auxiliary division had a somewhat mixed record in fulfilling the aim of attracting additional students and bringing in more income, but one of its elements was of lasting significance. This was an innovative program in journalism that eventually evolved into the present Department of Journalism. Sophia's position within the elite category of university ordinance universities was nevertheless not strong. It was very small. The university ordinance section had an annual admission quota of 120 students and an overall enrollment capacity of 600 students, which put it at the bottom of university ordinance universities in terms of size. Sophia had never been able to fill its smaller enrollment capacity under the specialized school ordinance. And as you can see from the table, initially it struggled to do so under the university ordinance as well. Gradually, things improved though, and in 1932, total enrollment was 533 students, a little less than 90% of enrollment capacity. Let's turn now to look at the military training program and Sophia's relationship to it. From the Meiji period, secondary schools and institutions of higher education could apply to have their students receive deferrals of conscription. Sophia obtained this deferral privilege at the time of its founding in 1913. In 1925, a new element was added to the relationship between schools and the military. This was a system administered jointly by the Army and the Ministry of Education, under which Army officers on active duty would be posted to secondary schools and institutions of higher education to conduct training in military drills, tactics, and spirit as an extension of physical education classes. If those who received this training were later conscripted, the time they spent in actual military service would be reduced, and they would be treated as candidates to become officers. The military training program was established at a time of military retrenchment after the First World War. And one of its aims was to ensure military readiness in case of future need. It also was seen as a bulwark against the rise of leftist thought among youth, something that the government feared deeply. The military training program was compulsory for state middle schools and some higher level state schools, but participation was voluntary for universities and for private middle schools and institutions of higher education. Notably, though, almost all applied to participate. Whether or not schools really wanted to have an officer on campus, the advantages that the training program offered, the reduction in the time spent in service if one were later conscripted, and the possibility of becoming an officer rather than an ordinary soldier, made it in effect a kind of credential. Schools felt that they needed to be able to offer that credential, especially if their competitors were doing so. This was true of Sophia as well. In 1927, Sophia added a physical education class to its curriculum and hired a retired Army officer to teach it. The next year, along with applying for elevation to a university ordinance university, Sophia applied to participate in the military training program and asked for surplus Army rifles to use in it. The application was accepted, and an active duty officer was dispatched to campus from 1929. Because space on campus for practicing Army drills was limited, the military training classes also held off-campus intensive drill sessions at Army bases, such as the one near Mount Fuji. With this as background, let's look at the event that marked the beginning of the war period for Sophia, the Yasukuni incident. The Manchurian incident of September 1931 gave new weight to the place of the military in Japanese life and to expressions of support for those who engaged in military actions on the nation's behalf. One such expression was to show reverence for those who had died in the Manchurian incident and had been enshrined at Yasukuni. In May 1932, the military training officer posted to Sophia thus took his classes to Yasukuni to pay homage to the war dead. At the time, the Catholic Church taught that believers should not participate in shrine rites in any form. And so, when the officer took his classes to Yasukuni, a few students in one, who were Catholic, did not bow or otherwise offer reverence. The officer reported this matter to his superiors, and the Army, flexing its muscles, informed the Ministry of Education that it had decided to withdraw the officer from Sophia. The school's unpatriotic behavior showed that it did not deserve to have a military training officer, the Army asserted. It asked the Ministry of Education to agree to the officer's removal. The university learned of this situation from an urgent phone call from the Ministry of Education. The call came on June 14th, the same day that the university held a ceremony with many prominent guests to celebrate the completion of the building, completion of Building 1 and of the process of elevation to a university ordinance institution. Ironically, in his speech on that occasion, President Hoffman stressed Sophia's commitment to nurturing loyalty to the emperor and the state. The unwelcome message about the Army's demand that the Ministry of Education agree to the removal of the officer from an unpatriotic school set off a complex series of behind-the-scenes negotiations. The Army's demand presented a threat not only to Sophia, but also to the Ministry of Education, which had accredited the university and was responsible for supervising it. The Ministry of Education had a policy of promoting visits to shrines by school children and older students, and it cannot have been happy about the Sophia students' failure to pay reverence at Yasukuni. But it also could readily see the Army's larger aim to expand its overall influence, and the Ministry of Education was concerned to protect its own authority and position against that aim. The Ministry of Education thus resisted the Army's demand that it agree to the officers' withdrawal. And over the next several months, it came to a tacit compromise with the university and Catholic Church leaders in Tokyo regarding the problem that shrine visits posed for Catholics. In late September, the Church sent a formal inquiry to the Ministry of Education about the reason for having school children and students visit shrines. And the ministry in turn issued a brief written response. The response's careful wording made it possible for the Church to change its position on such visits and to treat them not as a religious act, but as a civil and patriotic one in which Catholic students could participate. Far from bringing the Army to soften its position, however, this turn of events led it to dig in its heels. Eventually, in December 1932, without getting the Ministry of Education's agreement, the Army succeeded in removing the officer by carrying out a larger rotation of personnel in which it left the replacements for Sophia unspecified. For Sophia, this situation presented an ever-deepening crisis. The incident and the threat of removal, and then the actual removal of the officer from an unpatriotic school, got into the newspapers with much bad publicity. There was unrest within the university, with students demanding that the university take action to get the officer back. Students left, and applications and the overall enrollment dropped drastically, as you can see from the table. By the beginning of 1934, enrollments were barely 1/3 of capacity. And once the Army had gotten the upper hand by, in fact, in effect removing the officer, Sophia and the Ministry of Education were left with few options other than begging for a replacement. This Sophia did with ever more fervent declarations of the university's patriotic sentiments, including its now affirmative view of paying reverence at shrines. Eventually, in late 1933, a year and a half after the incident's start, the Army relented and dispatched a new officer to Sophia. But the incident left a deep impact on the university's leaders. The lesson that they above all took away from it was to avoid at all costs something like that happening again. As our third topic, let's look at some of the ways this perspective shaped Sophia's response to the developments of the following years as the war on the continent intensified and expanded. One thing that shows the incident's impact is the care that the university took to show respect for the military training officer once he had been restored. In January 1934, for instance, the university held a ceremony to welcome the newly dispatched officer, and it put out a pamphlet to celebrate the occasion. On other occasions too, such as entrance ceremony, the university consistently put the officer to the fore as a central member of the faculty. We see another clear example of this in the photo commemorating the campus visit of the president of Georgetown University, who happened to be in Japan in the fall of 1934 for a meeting of the International Red Cross. The photo shows the officer standing on one side of the Georgetown president with President Herman Hoffman on the other. Another thing that shows the after effects of the Ascani incident is the emphasis that Sophia's leaders put thereafter on demonstrating the university's loyalty to the emperor and state. For instance, from at least 1935, the Sophia entrance ceremony incorporated a ceremonial recitation of the imperial rescript on education handed down by Emperor Meiji in 1890. University records show that the recitation followed a protocol for treating the rescript with immense reverence as an embodiment of the bond between the emperor and the populace. Following the ceremony, faculty, staff, and students made a mass pilgrimage to Meiji Shrine. Sophia conducted recitations of the rescript on education on major national ceremonial days, like the emperor's birthday as well. It evidently was at the forefront of universities doing so. According to recent research, a Ministry of Education survey in 1937 found that only 5 of 16 universities located in Tokyo were celebrating the national ceremonial days in what the ministry considered to be a proper manner. One was Sophia. The other 4 were Tokyo Imperial University and of private universities, Waseda, Rissho, and Senshu. Attention to ceremonial expressions of loyalty carried over into support for the war effort. In late August 1937, following the expansion of hostilities in North China into full-scale war, the government adopted a policy of nationwide spiritual mobilization, 国民精神総動員. In the following years, laws and directives about specific measures to channel the nation's resources, spiritual, mental, and material, towards the war effort were issued in ever more thoroughgoing form. Sophia responded quickly to the policy. In September 1937, even before the government issued a directive calling specifically for organizing spiritual mobilization activities in schools, the Sophia student body met and declared its intention to cooperate with the policy by gathering monetary contributions for the Army and Navy, and by establishing an association dedicated, dedicated to promoting spiritual mobilization. The association's name, Rising Sun and Eagle Association, Kyokushukai, combined the national symbol of the rising sun with Sophia's eagle. Sophia again responded quickly when the Ministry of Education called in June 1938 for concrete support activities like offering voluntary labor service. The same month, President Herman Hoivers gave a talk to the student body in which he urged all to participate in offering such services. The following year, 1939, the government created a program for sending groups of students to perform voluntary labor services in Manchuria and northern China during the summer break. Excuse me. That summer, 3 Sophia professors and 25 students took part in the program. In December 1939, President Hoivers himself led 120 Sophia students in offering labor services at the grounds in front of the Imperial Palace. Let me mention 2 other examples of ways in which the university expressed support for the war. As the Japanese forces advanced through northern China and the Shanghai-Nanjing area in the fall and early winter of 1937, the university and the Kyokushukai held several events to track their progress. Among other things, on December 13th, the day Japanese forces occupied Nanjing, the university conducted a ceremonial recitation of a rescript that the emperor had issued to praise the loyalty and valor of the forces fighting in northern China. After the recitation, the staff and student body made a mass pilgrimage to Yasukuni. The university also sent a congratulatory telegram to General Matsui Iwane, the commanding officer of the Japanese forces in Nanjing. The other example dates from later in the war period. It is a Japanese flag, the sort given to soldiers going off to battle, signed by their fellows as an expression of encouragement and support. It was recently donated to the Sophia Archives by its recipient, who entered Sophia in 1941, majored in German literature, and was conscripted before graduation. What makes the flag particularly notable is the inscription and names at the top. The 4 graphs of the inscription say Hakko-yu, the 8 corners of the realm united under one roof, a slogan that provided ideological support for the idea of an East Asian co-prosperity sphere led by Japan, and that thus served also to justify the war. To the left of the inscription is the signature of the university president at the time, Tsuchihashi Yachida. To the right is the signature of Udagoro, a Sophia graduate who became professor of German literature at the university. Professor Uda also added his German translation of a Manyoshu poem that was widely promoted during the war as a call for the Japanese people to offer themselves as a shield for the emperor. Clearly, the flag was not just a gift from the recipient's fellow students, but an official statement by the university. Let me now turn to the fourth and final topic that I would like to take up today. The situation regarding higher education in the last most intense stages of the war and its impact on Sophia. As we mentioned above, as the war expanded, the government pursued ever more extensively the policy of nationwide mobilization. For institutions of higher education, things reached a peak in the fall of 1943, when the government ended the deferment of conscription for all students who were not engaged in studies seen as crucial to the national interest, which meant primarily science and engineering. For a Bunkei school like Sophia, which at this time had no program in these areas, the ending of deferments meant that all students over the age of 20 were now subject to conscription. From 1944, the conscription age was lowered to 19. Professor Nakai Noihito, who previously taught in the Sophia Department of History and now is at the University of Tokyo, has made a comprehensive study of how this affected Sophia students. He calculates that at least 756 Sophia students entered military service between 1937 and 1945. Of these, 644, the vast majority, did so after deferments ended in October 1943. At least 28 of these 644 students are known not to have survived. The actual number may well be higher. Iconic images of the mass send-off of new student conscripts that was held in Meiji Jingu Stadium in the pouring rain on the 21st of October, 1943, sum up the tragedy of student conscription, one of many tragedies of the war. On the 15th of November, Sophia held its own send-off ceremony for the Sophia students who were conscripted at this time. Here, however, to give a fuller picture of the war's overall impact on Sophia, I would like to focus on institutional issues. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japan as yet had very few institutions of higher education that provided training in engineering and the sciences. To coordinate and channel resources nationwide in support of the war, the government sought to promote the expansion of such programs. Concurrently, it imposed limits on the teaching of non-essential subjects. In the fall of 1943, Along with ending student deferments, it thus ordered universities to reduce admissions to Bunkei faculties to 1/3 of the existing allotment. And it urged Bunkei schools to consider amalgamating or to reduce their operation by entrusting their current students to other schools. In 1944, the government further ordered institutions of higher education to put the off-campus performance of labor services at the center of their curriculum. In effect, working in factories supporting the war effort replaced classroom study of Bunkei subjects. These policies presented private universities, most of which were heavily oriented towards Bunkei subjects, with tremendous operational challenges. At the same time, recent research by Professor Ito Akihiro of Nagoya University has shown that universities showed considerable resilience in dealing with the challenge. The late 1930s and early 1940s were, in fact, a time of growth for private universities. As the graph shows, a growing social demand for higher education and the establishment of the university ordinance universities led to a threefold increase in overall enrollments in those universities between 1920 and 1930. The Depression caused a leveling off in enrollments for several years. But from 1937, when the war with China began, enrollments surged again, almost doubling between 1937 and 1943. Presumably, one key reason for this surge was the attraction of a student deferment of conscription. The end of deferments for Bunkei students and the restrictions on enrollments in Bunkei subjects from the end of 1943 brought a sharp drop in the last 2 years of the war. But even so, overall enrollments in 1945 were still higher than they had been in 1937. Private universities competed for students throughout this period by reshaping programs and adding classes in areas that appealed to the current of the time, such as colonial development. The restrictions on enrollments in 1943 in Bunkei fields and the ending of deferments for students majoring in those areas posed obstacles to that strategy, but in response, many universities tried in the last years of the war to develop programs in engineering and science. Only a few large universities like Waseda, which already stood out for having a strong science and engineering faculty, were able to create such programs within the university proper. Most tried instead to branch out through auxiliary division programs, which were easier to initiate. Very few followed the suggestion to amalgamate or to entrust their students to other schools. Rikkyo entrusted the students in its Faculty of Letters to Keio, while adding auxiliary division science program. Keio itself absorbed an engineering university that had been established in 1939 and transformed it into a new Faculty of Engineering. Sophia's course of development from 1937 to 1945 fit into this general pattern. As the table shows, enrollments increased over threefold in that period. In 1937, reflecting the lingering impact of the Yasukuni incident on enrollments, there were still only 133 applicants and 94 entrants to the main university division. Thereafter, however, applications, admissions, and overall enrollments increased rapidly. In 1942 and 1943, there were well over 1,000 applications for admission to the university division. Even in 1945, with the restriction on enrollments and counting students on leave because they had been conscripted, the total combined enrollment of the university and auxiliary divisions was close to 900. Of course, as Sophia also followed the directive to dispatch students to perform labor services in factories, many of the students enrolled likely were not actually taking classes on campus. Responding to the overall rise in demand for university education, Sophia, like other universities, also expanded its offerings in these years. In 1942, it extended the preparatory division from 2 years to 3, and it also rearranged the Faculty of Letters to add a new department of history. The application for approval shows clearly the effort to present the new department as serving the national needs of the day. It notes that the department would be a pioneer in the study of Japan's historical relations with the countries of the South Sea region of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and it would prepare students to work in colonial development after graduation. The curtailment of enrollments the following year put an end to the extension of the preparatory division, but the Department of History would be a lasting addition to the university. The last 2 years of the war stretched Sophia's capacity to adapt to its limits. In May 1944, Sophia, like Rikyo, entrusted students to Keio. In its case, it entrusted 56 students from the Commerce Department to Keio. The specific rationale for doing this is not clear, but it perhaps was linked to a parallel move to carry out a major reconstruction and add an engineering component by amalgamating with Kowa University of Technology, the forerunner of the present Chiba University of Technology, a private university that had just been established in 1942. The idea was to dissolve Sophia's existing framework and create a new joint institution to be named Towa University, East Asia University. The plan also envisioned expanding the journalism section of the auxiliary division to incorporate training in skills needed by battlefield journalists. A proposal to this end was submitted to the Ministry of Education in January 1944. The plan for amalgamation seems to have proved ultimately a stretch too far for Sophia's leaders. The details again are not clear, but at the end of summer 1944, the proposal was withdrawn for further consideration. Even if it proved abortive, however, the move towards amalgamation suggests that wartime exigencies led Sophia, like other universities, to seek to add a science component. It is perhaps not too far-fetched to see this attempt as laying the seeds for the eventual addition of the Faculty of Science and Technology in 1962. I hesitate to draw any definitive conclusion from this brief review of some of the complexities of Sophia's experience of the era of war. Let me say simply that I hope that, together with mourning and reflecting on the war's costs and tragedies, we will not see these years as something that belongs to the past and is not that pertinent to the present. The dilemmas of these years, the choices for better or for worse, the innovations, all contributed to shaping Sophia as it is today. They are part of Sophia's and our heritage. Thank you very much.
中井先生、ご講演ありがとうございました。戦時中の日本の状況、特に上智大学の複雑な立場などが絡み合った時代を分かりやすくご説明いただきました。皆様もより詳細に聞きたいなどの思いもあるかとは思うんですけれども、本日は時間の関係で質問の時間を設けておりません。より詳しく聞きたいという方は、ぜひこのプログラム終了後の懇親会で先生に質問をしていただければと思います。もう一度先生に拍手をお願いいたします。